In the centuries before European ships arrived, rural India functioned through a network of self-managing agricultural communities. At harvest time, these villages produced food while organizing their own complex local economies. Charles Metcalfe, a British acting governor-general, famously described these settlements as little republics. They maintained their own irrigation systems, resolved local disputes, and pooled resources to ensure food security, surviving intact as regional empires rose and fell around them. This resilience was tested by cyclical droughts. Historically, when the monsoon rains failed, regional rulers would often suspend tax collections and open local granaries to help communities survive the dry season. The East India Company introduced a different pressure: revenue collectors who demanded rigid cash taxes regardless of the weather or the harvest. This chart illustrates global economic output over 3 centuries. In the 1700s, India produced roughly 1/4 of the world's wealth. By the end of colonial rule, that share had dwindled to almost nothing, while Britain's share expanded as it extracted resources from the subcontinent. This collapse reflects a change in the subcontinent's economic purpose. Local self-sufficiency gave way to a system focused on exports and foreign profit. The first pillar of this system was the revenue policy. British administrators decoupled tax obligations from actual harvest yields. Farmers were forced to sell their tools, their seeds, and their cattle to meet relentless cash quotas. When 2 consecutive years of crop failures struck Bengal, the East India Company maintained, and in some areas, increased the land tax. The resulting Great Famine between 1770 and 1772 killed an estimated 10 million people, eliminating nearly 1/3 of the region's population. Colonial administrators argued these events were unavoidable natural disasters. This ledger tracks the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878. While up to 8 million Indians perished from starvation on the left side of the ledger, the right side reveals what was happening at the ports. During those exact 3 years, the colonial administration exported 1 million tons of rice per year from India to Britain. The food existed. It was simply moved out of reach and shipped away. The Viceroy of India, Lord Lytton, enforced a strict policy against interfering with soaring food prices. At the height of the starvation, he hosted a week-long feast in Delhi for 68,000 officials and aristocrats. Mass starvation in British India followed specific policy choices. Free market principles were selectively enforced to protect colonial ledgers, ensuring trade revenues continued to flow regardless of the cost to human life. Agriculture was only one target. The second pillar was a process of forced deindustrialization, targeting India's manufacturing sector. For centuries, Indian artisans produced the world's most sought-after textiles. Intricately woven fabrics like muslin, calico, and chintz were in such high demand globally that European merchants often used them as currency across Asia. This chart illustrates how the British government dismantled that dominance. They imposed heavy duties on Indian textiles entering Britain, making them artificially expensive. Simultaneously, they forced India to accept machine-made British goods entirely free of tariffs. Unable to compete under these manipulated trade laws, Indian exports plummeted. The subcontinent became a consumer market for British factories and a supplier of raw materials, like the blue dye harvested in these indigo vats. This trade manipulation wiped out generations of skilled artisans. Entire communities of weavers lost their livelihoods, which forced them into poverty on land that was already heavily overtaxed. To manage this massive transfer of wealth, the British replaced traditional village councils with a centralized bureaucracy whose primary function was to enforce tax collection. This brings us to the third pillar, the idea that the British gifted India modernization through infrastructure like railways and telegraphs. This map shows the early railway network. The lines largely ignore existing internal trade routes between Indian cities. Instead, they move raw materials from the deep interior directly to the coastal ports for export to Europe. The network also allowed colonial forces to rapidly deploy troops from military cantonments to crush regional uprisings before they could spread. These massive projects were not British investments in India's future. They were paid for almost entirely by tax revenue squeezed from the Indian populace. Colonial infrastructure functioned as a conveyor belt. Indians were forced to fund the very tools used to accelerate the movement of their own resources out of the country. In 1901, a political leader named Dadabhai Naoroji published an exhaustive audit of these policies. He formulated the drain of wealth theory to calculate the true mathematical cost of the British Raj. Nauroji demonstrated that a systematic pipeline was moving wealth from Indian soil directly into the factories of the British Industrial Revolution. India was effectively financing its colonizers' global rise. Modern economic estimates place the total wealth drained from India between 1765 and 1938 at roughly $45 trillion in today's value. Those trillions represent a physical reality. That balanced ledger was paid for with the erasure of ancient, self-sustaining communities and millions of human lives lost to preventable starvation. This extraction created a trade pattern where the subcontinent provided cheap raw materials while serving as a forced market for expensive imports. This system established the roots that modern global supply chains still follow today. The economic divide we see now is the visible consequence of those 2 centuries. It reflects the long-term impact of wealth being consistently moved out of a region rather than being allowed to develop within it.